The day Caroline Langston arrived in Dusty Creek, Nevada, with nothing but a battered trunk, a loaded derringer she did not know how to use, and a letter from a dead man, the whole town stopped breathing for just a moment. It was the spring of 1879, and Dusty Creek sat at the edge of the Nevada desert like a forgotten coin dropped between the rock and the sand. The main street was wide enough for two wagons to pass each other without argument, lined with a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a small church, and a sheriff's office that looked as though it had been punched in repeatedly by something large and indifferent. The mountains in the distance were violet in the morning light, and the air tasted of sage and dry earth, and the particular kind of hope that only the West could manufacture, thin and fierce, and absolutely unwilling to apologize for itself. Caroline stepped down from the stagecoach with the careful dignity of a woman who was terrified but had decided, quite firmly, that no one was going to know it. She was 23 years old, dark-haired, with eyes the color of good river water, and she had the kind of face that people looked at twice, not because it was conventionally beautiful in the way of parlor paintings, but because there was something alive in it, something restless and honest that made a person want to know what she was thinking. She wore a gray traveling dress that had once been fine and was now simply well cared for, and she held her small leather satchel against her side as though it contained everything of value, which, in fact, it did. She had come to Dusty Creek because her cousin, Thomas Langston, had written to her 6 months prior from this very town, telling her he had struck a modest claim on the edge of Silver Mesa, that the land was rough but honest, that he needed someone to help him run a small boarding house he was establishing, and that he would pay her passage and a fair wage, and that the West would do her good after the gray Philadelphia winters she had endured since their aunt passed. Caroline had accepted, packed her life into one trunk, and ridden 3 trains and 2 stagecoaches to get here. Thomas Langston had been dead for 11 days by the time she arrived. She did not know this yet, standing on the main street of Dusty Creek with the stagecoach rattling away behind her and the desert sun climbing toward noon. She only knew that Thomas was not there to meet her, and that the street was looking at her with the particular expression of a place that had seen too many people arrive with hope and leave without it. "You looking for someone, miss?" The voice came from the direction of the sheriff's office. A man was leaning against the post of the porch, arms folded, watching her with an expression that was not unkind but was measuring, the way a man measures a situation before he decides what to do with it. He was tall, perhaps 6'1", with dark blonde hair that needed cutting and jaw that was covered in 3 days of stubble. He wore a brown duster that had seen considerable weather, a battered hat pushed back on his head, and a star pinned to his shirt that caught the light when he straightened and stepped off the porch. He was maybe 28, 30 at the outside, and he moved with the ease of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. "I am looking for Thomas Langston," Caroline said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Something shifted in the man's expression. It was subtle, the way a shadow moves when a cloud passes overhead, but she caught it, and her chest went cold. "My name is Monroe Morgan," he said, reaching up to touch the brim of his hat. "I'm the deputy sheriff of Dusty Creek. Miss, why don't you come inside out of the sun for a minute?" "Where is my cousin?" she asked, and her voice was not quite as steady as it had been a moment before. Monroe Morgan looked at her for a moment, and she could see that he was the kind of man who did not lie, even when the truth was difficult, even when part of him might wish he could soften it down to nothing and hand it to her like a wrapped gift. "Thomas Langston passed on 11 days ago," he said quietly. "I am real sorry to tell you that, miss. I am genuinely sorry." The street continued its business around her. A horse stomped. A door opened and closed somewhere down the way. The mountains stayed violet and indifferent in the distance. Caroline Langston took a breath so deep it hurt, and then she said, "How?" It was not quite a question. It was more like the sound a person makes when they are preparing themselves. "He took sick," Monroe said. "Fever came on fast. Doc Henley did everything he could. Your cousin was a good man. The whole town knew it. She stood there for a moment, absorbing this, the weight of the words settling into her like stones dropping into still water. Thomas was gone. She was standing on a street in Nevada with a dead cousin, a trunk, and approximately $43, which was not enough to get back to Philadelphia even if she had wanted to go back to Philadelphia, which she did not, because there was nothing in Philadelphia for her either. The aunt was gone. The small house was sold. The gray winters were behind her, and now the West, which was supposed to be the answer, was presenting itself to her as a new and more spectacular problem. "Miss," Monroe said, and his voice was gentler now, "come inside. I'll get you some water and we can talk about what you need." She followed him into the sheriff's office because there was nowhere else to go. The office was clean, which surprised her. She had expected something rougher. There was a desk, 2 chairs, a rack of rifles along the wall, a small stove that was cold in the warming spring morning, and a window that looked out onto the main street. A tin coffee pot sat on the stove. There were papers on the desk, organized in a way that suggested the man who worked here had a mind that liked order. He poured her water from a pitcher and set it on the desk in front of her, then pulled the second chair around and sat down, elbows on his knees, hands loose between them, his hat in one of those hands. Without the hat, she could see his face more clearly. He had gray-blue eyes, the color of sky before a weather change, and there was a steadiness in them that she found, despite everything, oddly reassuring. "Your cousin left some things," Monroe said. "His claim on Silver Mesa, the boarding house building which is mostly built, and a small amount of savings. There's no will that we found, but being his kin, you'd be the natural heir of it. The town attorney, a man named Aldrich, can walk you through the legal side of it when you are ready." Caroline set the water glass down. "How much savings?" Monroe paused just a half beat. $62 and some change. She almost laughed. It came up in her throat and she pushed it back down because if she started laughing she was going to cry, and she was not going to cry in the sheriff's office on her first hour in Dusty Creek. "And the boarding house," she said, "how close to finished is it?" "Close," he said. "Maybe a month's work from a couple of good carpenters. Thomas had 2 local men on it. They stopped when he passed out of respect, but they could be persuaded to continue." She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked at the window, at the main street of Dusty Creek going about its business in the hot morning light. Then she looked back at Monroe Morgan. "I am going to finish it," she said. "The boarding house. I am going to run it myself." He studied her for a moment. "That's not a small undertaking," he said, without a trace of condescension in it, just honesty. "This town is rough on its edges. The boarding house will see minors and drifters and men who are not always easy to manage." "I grew up managing things that were not easy," she said. "I managed my aunt's house from the time I was 16. I know how to keep accounts and cook for a crowd and make a room clean, and I know when to be firm and when to let something go. I can learn the rest." Monroe Morgan looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression that was not quite admiration yet, but was the thing that comes just before it, the moment when a person realizes they might have underestimated someone. "All right," he said. "Then I suppose Dusty Creek just got itself a boarding house." She stayed at the hotel, a single room above the saloon that smelled of stale tobacco and old wood, for the first week while she met with attorney Aldrich, who was a dry, thin man in his 60s who seemed mildly astonished that she intended to take the inheritance rather than sell it and leave. She arranged for the Carpenters, 2 brothers named Ed and Pete Galvez, to resume work on the boarding house. She visited Thomas's small grave on the edge of town, in the shadow of a cottonwood that was just beginning to green up for spring, and she stood there for a long time talking to him quietly, telling him she was angry and she missed him, and that she was going to make something good of the thing he had started, because she did not know how else to honor the dead except to finish what they loved. Monroe Morgan came to check on her twice that first week. Not intrusively, and not in the way that some men in frontier towns came to check on a woman, which was not really checking on her at all. He came by the boarding house site once to see how the work was going and spoke briefly to the Galvez brothers in Spanish, which surprised her. And the second time he found her at the general store, arguing carefully with the proprietor, a man named Hatch, about the price of flour. "He's charging me more than the listed price," she said to Monroe, not because she needed help but because Monroe was standing right there, and she thought he should know what kind of commerce was being conducted in his town. Monroe looked at Hatch. Hatch looked at Monroe. The price came down without another word spoken. "You knew he would do that," she said afterward on the wooden walkway outside the store, squinting into the afternoon sun. "Hatch is a fair man most of the time," Monroe said. "He tests new people when he can. It's not something I approve of, but it's not criminal either. He'll be straight with you from here on." "I would have argued him down myself," she said. "I know," Monroe said. "I could see that." She looked at him. He was looking out at the street, one thumb hooked in his belt, his hat at its usual angle. There was something very still about him that she was beginning to notice, the way a deep river is still on its surface even when it is moving fast underneath. "Thank you for telling me about Thomas," she said. "You could have sent someone else. A lot of men would have sent someone else for a thing that hard." He turned to look at her then, and the gray-blue eyes were quiet and direct. "It was my job," he said, "and I didn't want it to be done wrong." She held his gaze for just a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then she picked up her flour and walked back to the hotel. The boarding house opened 6 weeks after Caroline Langston arrived in Dusty Creek, in the early days of May 1879, when the desert was in that brief, extraordinary bloom that happens when the rains have been kind, and the whole landscape went temporarily extravagant with color before settling back into its usual determination to survive on very little. She had painted the front of the building white, which caused some comment along the main street, as white was a difficult color to keep clean in a desert town, but she had decided that clean was the standard she was going to hold herself to, and the boarding house would simply have to agree. She had 6 rooms upstairs, a large kitchen and dining room on the ground floor, a small parlor with 2 chairs and a lamp, and a front porch with a bench. She hung a painted sign above the door, "Langston Boarding House, meals included, fair rates, no spirits on the premises." The last line caused the most conversation. "You'll lose half your business before you start," said a woman named Ruth Carver, who ran the town's laundry and had been one of the first people to come and introduce herself to Caroline with something approaching genuine friendliness. Ruth was 45, wide-shouldered, and had the direct, evaluating manner of a person who has worked hard for everything she owned and respected people who did the same. "Men in a mining town want their drink. Men in a mining town can get their drink at the saloon," Caroline said, arranging the parlor chairs. "I want a place where the miners can sleep in clean beds without worrying about getting robbed or fighting with someone soused on whiskey. I think there's a market for quiet." Ruth looked at her for a moment and then laughed, a big warm sound. "You might be smarter than this town deserves," she said. As it turned out, Caroline was right. Within 2 weeks, all 6 rooms were occupied. Her guests were 3 miners working the Silver Mesa claims, a traveling salesman named Hober who came through on a circuit, a schoolteacher who had recently arrived to open the town's first proper school, and a cattle broker who was in town for business and had been recommended the boarding house specifically because he was tired of sleeping in places where he worried about his luggage. She cooked breakfast and dinner, kept the rooms clean, kept the accounts in a leather ledger she had bought from Hatch's store, and went to bed late and rose before dawn. She was, for the first time in her life, building something that was entirely hers, and the feeling of it was exhausting and terrifying, and more satisfying than anything she had ever done. Monroe Morgan came by for dinner on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of May. He appeared at the door at 5:30, hat in hand, and said that he had heard her biscuits were worth the walk down the street, and he wondered if she had a spare seat at the table. She had been expecting him to come. in the way that you sometimes expect something without letting yourself think about it too directly. She showed him to the table and poured his coffee and put the biscuits in front of him and watched, with a satisfaction she kept entirely off her face, as he tasted one and went quiet in the way that people go quiet when something is better than they were prepared for. "Those are extraordinary," he said. "My aunt's recipe," she said, sitting down across the table. The other guests were present, carrying on their own conversations, and the dining room was warm and lamplit and smelled of roast beef and coffee. Caroline had worked hard to make it feel like a home, and in moments like this one she could see that it was succeeding. "How are you finding Dusty Creek?" Monroe asked. "I am finding it hard and interesting," she said, "which is what I expected. No regrets about staying." She thought about that for a moment. "I had nowhere else to be," she said, "but even if I had, I think I would have stayed. This place does something to a person, it gets into you." He nodded slowly. "That's true," he said. "I came here from Texas 6 years ago planning to stay 6 months, and here I am." "What brought you to Texas originally?" "I grew up there," he said. "Small ranch outside of San Antonio. My father ran cattle. I worked with him until I was 19, then I rode north with a cattle drive and just kept moving for a few years. Picked up the law work somewhere along the way." "You seem suited to it," she said. "The law work, you have a quality of paying attention that I think must be useful." He looked at her across the table, and there was that slight shift in his expression again, the one she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant she had surprised him in some way. "Most people don't notice things about me," he said. "Not careful things. Most people aren't paying attention," she said. The dinner continued, and after the guests had retired and the table was cleared, Monroe helped her carry the dishes to the kitchen without being asked, which was the kind of thing she noticed and filed away. He did not hover or try to make himself useful in a way that was really about being present. He simply helped, efficiently, and then said good night and put on his hat and went back to his office. She stood in her kitchen afterward, the warm lamp throwing its circle of light around her, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular aliveness that comes when something is beginning. The summer in Dusty Creek was brutal, as Nevada summers are, a heat that pressed down on the town from above and radiated up from the ground and met somewhere in the middle at a temperature that made every task twice as hard and required everyone to move at a pace adjusted for survival. Caroline adapted. She rose at 4 in the morning to cook before the worst of the heat, kept the boarding house as cool as she could with wet cloths over the windows in the afternoon hours, and served cold meals when hot ones were impractical. Her guests appreciated this without saying so, which was, she was learning, the primary way that Western men expressed appreciation. Monroe came to dinner twice a week through June. By July, it was 3 times. By August, she had stopped charging him full price for the meals, and he had stopped pretending not to notice. They had reached a kind of unspoken arrangement, and neither of them had yet spoken about what the arrangement actually was, because naming it would have required a particular kind of courage that they were both, apparently, still gathering. They talked during those dinners in a way that Caroline had not talked with anyone in years. Not since her aunt had been well. In the early days when the house on Chestnut Street was full of warmth and conversation, and Caroline was a girl who still believed that the life she was building for herself was going to resemble the life she was planning. Monroe was a man who had opinions about things and was not afraid to state them, but who listened, genuinely and completely, when she stated hers, and adjusted his position when she made a good point, which she found remarkable in a man of any era but particularly remarkable in the West, which was not generally known for its flexibility of mind. He told her about the problems of the town, the tensions between the mining companies and the independent prospectors, the occasional friction between the white settlers and the Paiute people whose land this had originally been, which Monroe spoke about with a directness and regret that she respected. He had clearly thought carefully about the injustice of it, the displacement, the broken treaties, The way the West had been built on a foundation of violence that everyone was now trying very hard not to look at too directly. "A man named Red Cloud came through here 2 summers ago," Monroe said one August evening, on the front porch of the boarding house after dinner, the night air finally beginning to cool as the sun dropped behind the mountains and left the sky a deep, burning orange. He was Paiute, moving his family through the territory. A couple of the miners from the Silver Mesa Company gave him trouble, said he was trespassing. "On his own land," Caroline said quietly. "On land that had been his people's land for generations before anyone called it Nevada," Monroe said, his voice flat and careful. "I ran the miners off and told them if I saw that kind of trouble again they'd spend a night in the jail. But the truth is the law doesn't protect him the way it should. The law was written to serve certain interests and not others. That's something I live with." Caroline looked out at the orange sky. "Does living with it feel like enough?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "but I do what I can from where I am. I try to make sure that in this town, in the space I can actually affect, things are as fair as I can make them. I know it's not justice, but it's the choice I have." She turned to look at him, his profile against the dying light, the long line of his jaw and the steadiness of him. "I think that's an honest answer," she said. "I think honest answers matter more than comfortable ones." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment the distance between them on the porch bench was very small, and the evening was very quiet, and something passed between them that was not yet a word but was definitely a thing. Then a horse came rattling down the main street at an injudicious pace, and Monroe stood automatically, his hand going to the star on his chest, reading the situation, and the moment broke into ordinary pieces. "Everything all right?" Caroline asked. "Probably just someone who had too much at the saloon," he said. He watched until the horse and rider sorted themselves out without incident, and then he settled back against the post. "Sorry. Don't apologize for your job," she said. "You'd stop being yourself if you did." He looked at her again with that expression she was collecting, the one that meant she had said something unexpected and true, and she felt the warmth of it move through her like a June morning. In September, a man came to the boarding house who made Caroline uneasy from the first moment she saw him. His name was Dale Cressick, and he took a room on a Tuesday, paid in advance for 2 weeks, and presented himself as a land speculator looking at properties in the area. He was perhaps 40, well dressed in a way that was slightly too deliberate, with pale eyes that moved around a room the way a man's eyes move when he is measuring what's in it and what it might be worth. He was polite enough at meals, but he asked questions. Not obvious questions, not rude ones, but the kind of careful questions that gather information from multiple angles, the way a river will find its way around any obstacle if given enough time. He asked about the boarding house, about Thomas Langston's original ownership, about the claim on Silver Mesa, about Caroline's finances and intentions. She answered what she chose to answer and deflected what she did not, with a smoothness she had developed from years of managing difficult social situations. She mentioned Cressick to Monroe on his next visit. Monroe went very still in the particular way he did when something had his complete attention. "Cressick," he said, pale eyes, brown coat, red cravat. "Yes, you know him." "I know of him," Monroe said, and his voice had gone careful. "He's connected to the Silver Mesa Mining Company. The bigger one, the company that's been buying up the independent claims. He's done it in 3 other towns to the north. Goes in, finds the vulnerable properties, buys them up cheap or pressures the owners into selling." Caroline felt the cold settle into her stomach. "He wants the boarding house. Or the claim on Silver Mesa, maybe both. Thomas's land is adjacent to the company's newest acquisition. It would give them better access to the northern vein." She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking. "He's not going to get it," she said. "I know," Monroe said. "But knowing that and making it happen are 2 different things. He'll try legal means first. The question is whether he has something on paper that gives him leverage." "Claim and the boarding house are both in my name now, transferred by the attorney," she said. "Aldrich was thorough. I made sure of it." Monroe nodded. then he'll need to either offer you enough to make selling attractive or find some other angle. Be careful. She looked at Monroe. You could ask him to leave, she said. I could if he breaks a law, Monroe said. But a man paying for his room and eating his meals is not breaking a law. I can't run someone out of town for being unpleasant, even if I want to. She appreciated that. She appreciated that he would not bend the law even when the law was frustrating. All right, she said. Then I will simply be very carefully and completely uninterested in selling, and I will wait him out. I'll keep an eye on him, Monroe said. Creswick made his offer at breakfast on a Thursday, sitting across the dining table with two of the miners watching from the other end with expressions of polite curiosity. He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket and laid it on the table in front of Caroline, and the number written on it was larger than she had expected. She looked at the paper. Then she folded it back up and pushed it across the table to him. No, thank you, she said, and poured his coffee with a steady hand. He took the paper back, his pale eyes doing their measuring thing. Miss Langston, that is a generous figure for a property of this type. It may be, she said, but I built this boarding house. Well, I finished building it, and I intend to run it for the foreseeable future. I am not selling. The land market in this territory is volatile, he said. What seems secure today? More coffee, Mr. Creswick, she said, not unkindly but with a finality that settled like a door closing. He accepted the coffee and did not raise the subject again that morning. But 3 days later, someone broke into the small office she had set up at the back of the boarding house, where she kept her accounts and the deed papers. The lock was forced and the files were gone through, though she could not determine that anything had been taken, because she kept the original deed documents in a strongbox that was hidden in the floor beneath a loose board, a precaution Monroe had suggested 2 weeks earlier. She was in the office when she noticed the disruption, papers not quite where she had left them, the lock on the filing box scratched in a way it had not been scratched before. She stood in the middle of the small room for a moment, feeling the particular cold anger that comes when someone has been in your space without your permission. Then she went to find Monroe. He came back with her and examined the lock and the room without touching anything unnecessarily. He was wearing his duster and his hat, and he moved through the room with the focused attention of a man reading a landscape, seeing things in the arrangement of small details that she would not have seen alone. The deed papers, he said. Are where you told me to put them, she said. Something in his expression softened slightly with relief, and she found she was moved by it, the fact that he was relieved on her behalf, that the outcome of this mattered to him beyond his professional duty. Good, he said. Good. He didn't get what he came for then. Can you arrest him? I can talk to him, Monroe said. I can make very clear that this town does not tolerate this kind of interference with a property owner, and that if I see any further suggestion of it, he'll be answering some very formal questions. That may be enough to encourage him to take his business elsewhere. The conversation Monroe had with Creswick that afternoon was not one that Caroline witnessed, but she heard the substance of it later from Monroe himself, who was straightforward about what he had said and how it had been received. Creswick had listened, had not admitted to anything, had maintained his pleasant exterior, and had checked out of the boarding house the following morning. He was gone from Dusty Creek by noon. That's it, Caroline said when Monroe told her. Men like him look for easy targets, Monroe said. When the target is not easy, they move on. He found someone to do his dirty work and it didn't accomplish what he needed, and now he knows you have a solid legal position and someone paying attention. It's not worth his time and resources. She exhaled. I feel like I should have done something, she said. You did do something, he said. You stayed. You did not sell when he made it attractive to sell. You kept your documents safe. That was the fight and you won it. She looked at him across the office in the late afternoon light and said, without entirely planning to, Monroe, why do you keep coming to dinner? The question sat in the air between them. He was still in that deep river way of his, and then he said with a quiet plainness that was more direct than any elaborate declaration, because I like being near you, and because the food is genuinely excellent, but mostly the first reason. She felt the warmth start somewhere in her chest and move outward. "Well," she said, "then I think you should keep coming." Something shifted in his face, something that was not quite a smile but was the warmth that comes before a smile, and he said, "I intend to." October arrived in the desert with the sudden clarity that the West does autumn, the air sharpening, the mountains going from violet to a deep pure blue against the sky, the mornings cold and the afternoons warm and golden, and the whole territory feeling like it was taking a long, satisfied breath after the brutality of summer. Caroline had added a small vegetable garden at the back of the boarding house, which was producing late tomatoes and herbs and greens in abundance, and the dining room at Langston's had developed a reputation that extended beyond the immediate residence. Ruth Carver came to her in early October with a proposition. "There's a rancher named Holly's Pike who wants to hold a supper for 12 people, Ruth said. "He's celebrating the end of a successful cattle season and he wants it done right. He's heard about your cooking. He'll pay 3 times your normal rate." Caroline held the supper for Holly's Pike on a Friday evening, and it was the most successful night the boarding house had seen. She cooked for 3 days prior, and the evening itself was long and warm and full. And by the end of it, Holly's Pike was pressing her hand and telling her it was the finest meal he had eaten since leaving Missouri 10 years ago, and would she consider doing a similar thing for Christmas? She said she would consider it and went to bed that night too tired to lift her arms and profoundly, quietly happy. Monroe was at the supper. Holly's had invited him, and he sat at the table in a clean shirt that was not his work shirt, his hair cut and his face shaved. And Caroline noticed all of this in the way she noticed everything about him now, as something she was adding to a collection of details that added up to a man she was becoming increasingly certain about. After the guests had gone and the last dishes were washed and Ruth had gone home and the boarding house was quiet, Monroe stayed on the porch with a cup of coffee and waited, though she had not asked him to. She came out and sat beside him on the bench and they looked at the October night, which was enormous and full of stars, the way the desert night is, when there is no city light to dilute it and the sky shows you all of itself at once. "You did something remarkable tonight," he said. "I made beef stew and apple cake," she said. "You made 12 people feel at home in a building in the middle of the desert," he said. "That's a different kind of remarkable." She turned to look at him. The starlight was generous and the porch lamp was a warm yellow, and she could see his face clearly, the steadiness of it, the gray-blue eyes that had not looked away from her all evening in the moments when she had caught him looking. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you should say something," she said, "because I am not going to say it first." He looked at her for a moment and there was a humor in his eyes underneath the other things, the seriousness and the warmth. "Is that so?" he said. "It is so," she said. He put his coffee cup down on the rail and turned toward her on the bench, and when he spoke his voice was very quiet and entirely unambiguous. "Caroline, I have been coming to dinner for the past 4 months because I cannot think of a single thing in my day that I look forward to as much as sitting at your table and hearing you talk about what you're thinking. I think you are the most genuine person I have ever met in my life, and I think you could survive anything this territory chose to throw at you, and I also think you should not have to survive everything alone. And if you are of a similar mind about me, I would very much like to keep showing up at your door, not just for dinner." The night around them was very still. Somewhere across the town, a horse moved in a stable and the cottonwoods along the edge of the street whispered in a small wind. She reached across the distance between them on the bench and put her hand over his, which was resting on his knee, and said, "I am absolutely of a similar mind." He turned his hand over and closed it around hers, and the warmth of it was very solid and real, and she thought of Thomas's letter, of the gray Philadelphia winters, of the 3 trains and 2 stagecoaches, and the single moment on the main street, when everything she had planned had come apart and left her with nothing but herself. And she thought that perhaps all of that had been the road to this porch, this night, this hand in hers. "Good," Monroe said, and the word was simple and complete. They stayed on the porch for another hour, talking and not talking in about equal measure, which is one of the better kinds of companionship, and when Monroe finally stood to go, he held her hand for another moment and looked at her with the full weight of his gray-blue eyes and said, "I'll come to breakfast." "I start cooking at 4, she said. "I'll be here at 4, he said. He was. November in Dusty Creek brought the cold in earnest, and the boarding house became the warm center of its small world, lit and heated and full of the smell of Caroline's cooking, which had evolved over the months from good to something that people in the town talked about with genuine reverence. She had learned what she could from Ruth Carver about desert cooking, about the particular flavors of the territory, and she had combined these with the Eastern skills her aunt had taught her and produced something that was wholly her own. Monroe came every morning at 4 and sat in her kitchen and drank coffee and watched her work and talked to her about his night, about the town, about whatever was on his mind, and she told him what was on hers, and they existed in the easy commerce of two people who have established a genuine intimacy, the kind that is made not of grand gestures, but of accumulated small moments of honesty and attention. He helped her with things around the boarding house that required strength or height, not because she asked, but because he noticed and offered, and he never made it into something that was about what he was doing for her, which she valued enormously. He fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking for a month. He renegotiated the wood delivery price for her when Hatch's supplier tried to raise rates without warning. He introduced her to a couple, James and Mabel Crow, who were half Shoshone and had a small farm on the edge of the territory, and produced extraordinary vegetables, and Caroline arranged a regular supply agreement with them that benefited everyone involved. She met James and Mabel's family on a Sunday afternoon when Monroe drove her out to the farm in his wagon, and the visit was warm and frank, and the kind of exchange between people who are treating each other as exactly what they are, which is human beings trying to make something work in a hard place. Mabel Crow made a coffee that was flavored with something Caroline could not identify and refused to name, and James showed them around the farm with a quiet pride in the land that Monroe clearly shared, the two men talking about soil and water and growing seasons, with the mutual respect of people who both understand that the land is the first fact and everything else comes after. On the ride back, the wagon moving slowly through the late afternoon desert, Monroe pulled the horse to a stop at the top of a low rise where you could see the full length of the valley spread out below. The town just a cluster of small lights beginning to appear as the sun went down, and the households lit their lamps. "I want to show you something," he said, getting down from the wagon and helping her down and walking her to the edge of the rise, where the view opened up completely, the valley and the mountains and the sky all happening at once in the full dramatic production of a Nevada sunset. She stood beside him and looked at it, the vast and indifferent beauty of it, and felt something she could only identify as belonging, which was a feeling she had been chasing for so long, through the gray Philadelphia winters and the years of managing other people's houses, that she had almost stopped believing she would find it. "This is what I want to show you," Monroe said, "when I think about what I love about this place. Not the town, although I care about the town. This." He gestured at the whole enormous thing of it. "The sheer fact of it." She looked at him. "You love it here," she said. "I do," he said. "I love it like it's a person. Is that strange?" "It's not strange at all," she said. "I think I understand it." He looked at her, and the sunset was doing something extraordinary with the light, and his expression was as open as she had ever seen it, all the layers of his usual reserve set aside, and he said, "I love you, Caroline." The words arrived in the air between them as something solid, and she felt them settle into her the way the desert had settled into her, the way the boarding house had settled into her, like a thing that had been waiting and was now home. "I love you, Monroe," she said, and it was the most honest sentence she had ever spoken. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with one careful hand, and then he kissed her, on the top of the low rise with the Nevada sunset burning itself out around them, and it was the kind of kiss that is also a promise. December arrived, and with it, the particular cold of the high desert winter, which is not the wet cold of the east but a dry, crystalline cold that makes the stars look as though someone has polished them. Caroline hung pine branches from the porch of the boarding house and put candles in the windows, and the Langston boarding house in the Christmas season became a place that people found reasons to visit beyond their usual business. She held the Christmas supper for Holly's Pike as promised, and it was grander than the October supper. 16 people around the extended table, and Monroe was there again. And this time he sat beside her rather than across from her, and Ruth Carver was there too, and the Galvez brothers who had built the place, and Doc Henley who had tried to save Thomas, and a dozen others who had become, in the month since her arrival, the fabric of her days. After the last guests had gone and the fire burned low in the hearth, Monroe took her hand and said, "Walk with me." They walked out into the cold Christmas night, their breath making small clouds, the stars overhead impossibly bright, the town quiet around them. He walked her to the edge of the cottonwood grove where Thomas's grave was, and she understood that he had thought about this, that he had chosen this place deliberately. "I want to ask you something," Monroe said, "and I want to ask you here because I think he should be part of it. It was his letter that brought you here, and I think that matters." She looked at the small grave in the starlight, the simple wooden marker with Thomas's name and dates. She felt the grief of it, which had not gone away and probably never would, and also the strange, specific gratitude she had for the letter and the journey and the impossible situation that had placed her on a main street in Nevada with nowhere to go and everything to build. Monroe turned to face her, and he was holding something, a small ring, a simple band of silver with a small turquoise stone that caught the starlight. "I had this made by a silversmith in Carson City," he said. "The turquoise is Nevada stone. I wanted something that was of this place." "Monroe," she said softly. "Caroline Langston," he said, "will you marry me?" The wind in the cottonwoods, the stars. The cold and clean desert air, Thomas's grave, quiet and present, the boarding house warm and lit at the end of the street. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and held her hand for a moment looking at it, and then he looked at her, and the gray-blue eyes were full of something so warm and complete that she felt it in every part of herself. They were married in February of 1880, in the small church at the end of the main street, on a bright cold morning when the desert was still brown and waiting for spring. But the sky was a blue so pure it seemed impossible. The church was full, which surprised Caroline until she realized that she had spent 7 months cooking for this town and caring for it and being honest with it, and the town was full of people who had noticed. Ruth Carver stood beside her as her witness. A deputy named Hector Vega, who had been Monroe's partner for 4 years, stood beside Monroe. The preacher was a young man named Good who had a slight tremor in his voice that disappeared entirely when he spoke the words of the ceremony, as though the ritual itself steadied him. Caroline wore a dress she had sewn herself, blue wool, not white, because white was impractical, and she had always believed that the things you wore for important occasions should be things you could actually use afterward. She carried a small bunch of pine branches and dried sage tied with a ribbon, because there were no fresh flowers in Dusty Creek in February, and she thought this was more honest anyway. When Monroe said the words of the vow, he held both her hands and looked at her steadily and spoke as though he were making a report of facts that he had determined beyond any doubt and was now stating for the record. She found it tremendously moving. She said her vows with equal certainty, and when it was done and the preacher said they were married, the church full of Dusty Creek's residents responded with the kind of enthusiastic approval that suggested they had all been waiting for this to happen and were deeply pleased that it finally had. Monroe kissed her in front of the congregation with a thoroughness that made Ruth Carver laugh and the preacher look mildly startled. That evening, after the small celebration that Ruth had organized in the parlor of the boarding house, after the guests had gone home and the fire had burned down, and the new ring was on her finger and everything was settled into its new arrangement. Caroline stood in the kitchen of her boarding house, which was also now the home she shared with her husband, and felt the completeness of it like a physical thing. Monroe came into the kitchen and stood behind her and put his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head, and they stood together in the warm, quiet kitchen listening to the desert night outside. "Mrs. Morgan," he said. She smiled. "That will take some getting used to. Good kind of getting used to, I hope." "The best kind," she said. Spring 1880 came in with the desert's usual extravagance of color, the brief flowering that made you understand why people loved this hard, beautiful, difficult place with a fierceness that was out of proportion to its comforts. Caroline's garden came back with more vigor than it had shown the previous fall, and she expanded it, running a second bed along the south wall of the boarding house and planting a cherry tree whose blossoms she was already imagining. Her life had settled into a rhythm that was full and rich in a way that was entirely different from the busyness of the boarding house's first year. She still cooked and kept accounts and managed the guests, but now Monroe was beside her in the evenings, and they talked about the town and the business and the future, and she was part of his work in the way of a person who knows the context and cares about the outcome. He had been offered the position of full sheriff when old Walsh retired in the winter, and he had taken it, and the star was now a larger star on a different shirt, and with it came a somewhat larger responsibility and a somewhat larger target on his back, which was something Caroline thought about more than she mentioned. She mentioned it once in the spring, when a difficult situation with a group of cattle drivers passing through had resulted in Monroe spending 2 nights in a row managing things that could have gone wrong in several directions before they went right. He came home at 3 in the morning of the second night and she was awake, sitting in the kitchen with the lamp lit, because she did not sleep well when the nature of his work was active. "You're awake," he said, setting his hat on the hook by the door. "I was thinking," she said. "About me, not a question. About the fact that you could be shot," she said plainly, because she was not a person who dressed things in better clothing than they deserved. He sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said. "It's a real possibility and I won't tell you otherwise." "I know," she said. "I married you knowing that. I'm not asking you to change your work. I'm just saying that I think about it." "What do you want from me?" he asked, not defensively, genuinely the way he always asked questions. She thought about it. "I want you to be careful," she said, "as careful as your job allows, and I want you to always come home." "I will always try to come home," he said. "That's enough," she said. "That's an honest answer." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "You are the reason I am always motivated to try," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "Good," she said. "Now I'm going to make you something to eat because you look like you haven't had a meal since yesterday morning, which is probably true." He watched her move around the kitchen with the lamp throwing its warm light on everything, and she felt his eyes on her and felt, as she always did in these moments, the simple, extraordinary fortune of being known by someone. The summer of 1880 brought a complication that neither of them had planned for precisely, and both of them had, in the private places of their thinking, hoped for. By July it was clear that Caroline was expecting a child. Doc Henley confirmed it with his usual professional restraint, and Caroline walked back from his office in the late July heat and told Monroe in the kitchen of the boarding house, standing at the table with her hands on the back of a chair, and her face doing something she could not entirely control. Monroe went still in the way he did when something had his complete and undivided attention. Then he stood up from his chair and put his arms around her and held her for a long moment without speaking, and she felt against the side of her head the fact that he was breathing somewhat faster than usual, which she found deeply endearing in a man so generally composed. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said, half laughing into his shoulder. "I mean," he said, "all right in the very best sense. All right in the sense of everything being more than all right. All right in the sense of the world being an extraordinary place." She pulled back to look at him, and his expression was exactly what she had hoped it would be. "We are going to have to hire more help for the boarding house," she said, because she was also a practical person. "Yes," he said, "and we are going to add a room on the house." "Are you planning to build it yourself?" "With Ed and Pete Galvez, yes. I helped them enough times, I know the work." "You are occasionally surprising," she said. "Good kind of surprising, I hope," he said, borrowing her own phrase back to her. She kissed him for that, which was her answer. The room was built by October, a proper bedroom added to the back of the boarding house, with a window that looked out over the garden and the desert beyond. It was a good room, solid and warm, and Caroline stood in it one evening in the early fall with her growing figure, and the new smell of fresh-cut wood around her, and felt the life she was building pressing against her from all sides with a fullness she had not known was possible. Ruth Carver organized a gathering of the women in town in November, bringing small gifts for the coming baby, blankets and a carved wooden rattle, and a tiny pair of boots that a woman named Sarah Hollies had made by hand. Caroline sat in the center of it all, receiving the warmth of this community of women in a territory that was still rough and uncertain and full of difficulty. And she thought of the Philadelphia winters again, of the aunt's house and the loneliness of it, and she felt the distance between then and now as a measurement of something she could not quite name but was deeply grateful for. James and Mabel Crow visited in December, and Mabel brought her own kind of gift, a beaded covering for the cradle Monroe had built, blue and white and green, with patterns that Mabel explained had meaning in her own people's tradition, protection and growth, and the continuity of things. Caroline received it with the full weight of what it was and hugged Mabel and thanked her in a way that was not performative but simply true. In February of 1881, exactly 1 year after their wedding day, Caroline and Monroe's son was born. Doc Henley attended, and Ruth was there, and the labor was long and difficult, and at the end of it Monroe, who had stayed as close to the door as Doc Henley would allow, came into the room and saw his wife holding a red-faced, loudly protesting boy with a surprising amount of dark hair, and sat down in the chair beside the bed and put his face in his hands for just a moment. "Monroe," Caroline said. He looked up. His eyes were wet, which was something she had not seen before and which she tucked carefully away as one of the most precious things she had ever been given. "He's here," she said. "Come and see him." Monroe came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and the enormous man and the very small new person looked at each other with matching grave expressions, and Caroline watched them and felt a love so large it seemed impossible that it fit inside a person. They named him Thomas for her cousin. Thomas Monroe Morgan, who arrived in the world on the anniversary of his parents' marriage with strong lungs and a forthright attitude about being hungry, which did not change in the months that followed. The years settled in around them like good weather. Thomas grew from the fierce small creature of his first months into a bold, curious boy who followed Monroe around the town, asking questions about everything with a relentless thoroughness that Monroe answered with total patience and Caroline watched with a delight that never diminished. Thomas had his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and his own entirely particular personality, which was neither of theirs exactly but was clearly made of both. The boarding house continued to grow. Caroline hired a young woman named Elena Vega, Hector's niece, to help in the kitchen and with the rooms, and later a second helper. And the Langston house, as the town still called it even though the name above the door now said Morgan House, was the kind of institution that a town builds its memory around. Ruth Carver remained one of Caroline's closest companions, and the two women formed a friendship that was built on directness and mutual respect, and the particular kind of loyalty that comes when two people have seen each other at the difficult moments and continued to show up anyway. Ruth was at the house on a rainy April morning in 1882 when Caroline told her she was expecting again, and Ruth set down her coffee cup and reached across the table and squeezed her hand and said nothing, because nothing was required. Thomas was 14 months old when his sister arrived, a girl they named Eleanor, who came into the world with a startling calm that was immediately different from her brother's dramatic entrance, looking around the room with large dark eyes as though she had been expecting all of this and was not especially surprised. "She is already judging us," Monroe said, looking down at Eleanor's serene expression. "She will keep us honest," Caroline said. Dusty Creek grew through those years with the particular growth of a Nevada mining town, sometimes rapid and chaotic when a new vein was found and brought new workers and new commerce, sometimes quiet in the hard seasons when the mines produced less and the town contracted. Monroe kept his position as sheriff, year after year, re-elected without serious opposition, because he was known as a man who was fair and careful, and who could be counted on to apply the law without cruelty and without favoritism. There were hard times. There was a fire in the dry summer of 1883 that took out 3 buildings on the south side of the street, including the original hotel where Caroline had first stayed. No one was killed, which Monroe attributed to the fact that he had drilled the town on what to do with enough regularity that people responded quickly. The boarding house was not touched, which Caroline thought about with a private gratitude she never took for granted. There was a winter 2 years later when Thomas caught a fever that frightened both of them deeply, and Doc Henley spent 3 nights in the boarding house, and Monroe sat beside his son's bed through one of those nights with Caroline, the two of them talking quietly about everything except what they were afraid of, holding the vigil of parents who love a child and can do nothing but stay close. Thomas broke the fever on the 4th day, cranky and hungry and entirely himself, and Monroe went out to the porch alone for a few minutes, and when he came back in his face was the face of a man who has been very afraid and is now very grateful and has taken a moment to put himself back in order. Eleanor grew into a girl who was interested in everything with a focused intelligence that caught the attention of the schoolteacher, a second one by now, a woman named Mrs. Park, who had come from San Francisco and who told Caroline on a September afternoon in 1885 that Eleanor was one of the most remarkable students she had encountered in 15 years of teaching, with a particular gift for mathematics and an eye for precision. Caroline sat with this information for a day and then told Monroe, and Monroe set down whatever he was doing and looked at her with a slow, full smile that was one of the expressions she kept in the collection, the warmth of it never diminished by repetition. "She gets the precision from you," he said. "She gets the stubbornness from you," Caroline said. "We make a good combination," he said. "We do," she agreed. Thomas at 6 was everything a 6-year-old in the West was likely to be. Loud, fearless, fascinated by horses and by the mechanics of his father's work, always underfoot when Monroe was cleaning the rifles or talking to the deputies, with a quality of absolute attention when something interested him that was precisely his mother's quality turned into boyhood. Monroe had given him a small job of sorts, which was to watch the horses tied outside the office and report anything unusual, and Thomas performed this duty with a seriousness that made every adult who witnessed it struggle to keep a straight face. In the spring of 1884, Monroe came home in the evening with something on his mind. Caroline could see it in the way he sat down at the kitchen table and poured his coffee with slightly less of his usual automaticity, the small displaced awareness of a man who is thinking hard. She waited. She had learned his rhythms over 4 years of marriage, the way the river of him ran, and she knew when to ask and when to let him come to it. "I have been asked to run for territorial marshal," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Tell me about that." "It would mean more territory to cover," he said. "More travel, away from the house more. But it would also mean more ability to affect things on a larger scale." The business with the mining companies and the independent claims, what happened with Cressick, that kind of pressure is happening all over the territory. A marshal has more tools than a sheriff. Would you still be based here? She asked. Yes. Dusty Creek would be the base, but I would be riding circuit. She thought about it. She thought about Thomas at 6 and Alina at 2, and the boarding house and the cherry tree she had planted that was finally producing fruit, and the way Monroe looked when he was doing work that was meaningful to him. I think you should do it, she said. He looked at her. It's a harder situation for you and the children. We will manage it, she said. We have managed everything else, and you said it yourself, the ability to affect things on a larger scale. You have spent 4 years being fair and careful in Dusty Creek. Imagine doing that across the whole territory. He was quiet for a moment. You make it sound straightforward. It is not straightforward, she said, but it is right, and I know the difference. He reached across the table and took her hand. I knew you would say that, he said. Was that a test, she said. No, he said. I just knew. Monroe ran for territorial marshal and won, which surprised no one who had watched him work in Dusty Creek for 6 years. He was installed in the position in the fall of 1884, the star replaced again with the larger star of a United States territorial marshal, and his circuit took him across the northern Nevada territory on a schedule that he planned carefully to minimize his time away from home, because home was where his priorities actually lived. He was, as he had promised her from their earliest conversations, always trying to come home, and he almost always succeeded. The boarding house continued. Alina Vega had become indispensable, not just a helper but a genuine partner in the operation, managing the rooms and some of the cooking with a competence that let Caroline focus on the things that required her direct attention and allowed her to be present for Thomas and Alina in ways that the first exhausting year of the business had made difficult. Caroline paid Alina well and said so, that the wage was what a person's real labor was worth, and Alina had looked at her with an expression that was briefly surprised and then entirely loyal. Thomas at 8 learned to ride properly. On a steady bay horse Monroe had selected with great care for temperament, and Caroline watched from the fence of the small paddock on the edge of town on a September afternoon as Monroe walked beside the horse with his hand on the boy's leg and talked him through it, quietly and steadily, until Thomas was doing it himself, and the expression on the boy's face was an expression she recognized, the first moment of competence, the moment when the body understands that it can do the thing. She had to look away for a moment because the feeling was so large. Alina at 4 was conducting her own campaign, which was to be taken seriously as a person, which she was managing successfully through sheer force of personality. She sat at the kitchen table in the mornings while Caroline cooked and asked questions about what everything was and how it worked and why things were done the way they were done. And Caroline answered each one fully and precisely, and never once told Alina that it was not something she needed to know, because Caroline herself had been told that too many times as a girl and knew exactly what it did to a person's sense of what they were capable of. By 1886, Dusty Creek had settled into something that was not quite a finished thing, because no living place is ever finished, but was a functioning, layered community with a real school and a proper doctor's office, and a church that had been rebuilt in stone, and a newspaper that published twice a week, and a boarding house that was a center of town life in the way that the best such places always are. Ruth Carver had expanded her laundry into a full dry goods and tailoring business, which she ran with the same direct efficiency she brought to everything. Hector Vega had become the town sheriff when Monroe stepped up to marshal, and was doing the job with a careful solidity that reflected his years of partnership with Monroe. Ed and Pete Galvez ran a successful carpentry business that had built or improved half the structures on the main street. The Crow family's farm had grown and produced enough to supply several of the town's households, and James Crow's eldest son, a young man named Daniel, had become something of a local figure, respected and complicated and navigating the space between two worlds, with a difficulty that the town did not always acknowledge as fully as it should. Monroe talked about Daniel Crowe in his evening conversations with Caroline, the way someone talks about a situation they cannot entirely fix but refuse to stop thinking about. On an evening in October of 1886, Monroe came home later than expected, and when he came into the kitchen he had a look she had seen before but not often, the look of a day that had asked more of him than usual and received it. She poured his coffee without comment and sat across from him and waited. "I found a situation on the circuit today," he said. "A mining camp 20 miles east. Company men had moved into an area that the Paiute have been using seasonally for 30 years. The company has a legal claim on the mineral rights. The Paiute have a moral claim on the land, and neither of those things translates fully into what I actually have the authority to enforce." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you do?" "I documented everything," he said. "I required the company to show me their exact boundary lines, which took all morning and revealed that 2 of their 3 operation sites were outside their legal claim. Those I can act on. The third is legal under the Territorial Mining Charter, which is a flawed document to begin with, and there I am limited." "But you took back 2 of 3, she said. "It's not justice," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is something. And you documented everything, which means there is a record." He looked at her across the table. "Why do you always manage to make the right thing feel like enough when you say it, even when I know it's not?" "Because I'm not saying it's enough," she said. "I'm saying it's what you have and you did all of it. Those are different things." He reached across and covered her hand with his again, the gesture of years, worn smooth and certain. "I don't know what I would think through without you," he said. "You would think through it," she said. "You would just do it slower and more quietly." He laughed at that, the real laugh, the one she had taken months to earn the first time and which now lived comfortably in their kitchen, and she felt the tension go out of him with it and was glad. That winter they had the entire Crowe family for Christmas dinner, and the Galvez brothers, and Ruth Carver, and the Park family, and Doc Henley with his wife, and the table had to be extended with a second one from the parlor. And the children mixed together in the noisy democratic way of children who are comfortable with each other. And the adult conversation moved through half a dozen languages in pieces. Spanish and English, and the Shoshone words that Mabel Crowe used occasionally when a concept did not translate. And the whole thing was warm and loud and real. Thomas was 6 feet tall at 15. Which nobody had expected with his father's build and his mother's directness, already talked about in school as a boy who had a gift for argument, and a particular kind of fairness that he applied to situations with a seriousness that made his teachers slightly awed. Eleanor at 13 was deep in mathematics and showed no signs of surfacing, filling the margins of her school notebooks with calculations, and asking Monroe's deputies questions about the mathematics of trajectory when they came by the house, which flustered the deputies and delighted Eleanor. Monroe at 38 had the particular quality of a good man who has spent 15 years being responsible for something, and has allowed it to make him better rather than smaller. The gray-blue eyes were as steady as they had always been, and the lines at their corners were new but belonged there, the marks of attention and weather and laughter. His hair was shorter by habit now, cut by Caroline every few weeks in the kitchen, which was one of the ordinary intimacies she loved without ever finding it ordinary. In the summer of 1888, Caroline took on the project she had been thinking about since the beginning. She expanded the boarding house significantly, adding a proper dining room wing that could seat 40 people for events, which transformed the business from a boarding house with meals into something closer to the social center Monroe had once suggested she was running. She hired 2 more cooks, managed the expansion herself with the Galvez brothers, kept every account with the precision that Eleanor had apparently inherited, and opened the new wing in October with a dinner for the whole town. Dusty Creek came to the dinner in its entirety, or near enough to it, from Holly's Pike and his family to Daniel Crow and his, from the new school teacher and the young doctor who had come to assist Doc Henley to the miners and the merchants and the women who ran the various operations that kept the town alive. Monroe stood beside Caroline at the entrance and shook hands with everyone who came in, and she stood beside him and felt the deep satisfaction of something completed to her full standard. Later, after the dinner and the dancing, after the last guests had gone and the kitchen was cleaned and the children were in bed, she and Monroe sat on the front porch in the October night, the same bench they had sat on years before when everything was just beginning. The desert was quiet and enormous around them. The stars were the same stars. "You have built something extraordinary," Monroe said. "We have built something extraordinary," she said. "We together. And Thomas, the name above the door, comes from. And Ruth, who taught me to cook the desert way, and the Galvez brothers, and Alina, it is not mine alone." "No," he said, "but you are the one who stayed." She thought about that first morning on the main street, the stagecoach rattling away, and the $43, and the letter from a dead man, and the man who had stepped off the porch of the sheriff's office to give her the worst news with the greatest kindness. "I stayed," she said, "and then you gave me reasons to keep staying." He put his arm around her and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, looking out at the Nevada night, at the mountains dark against the stars, at the town quiet around them, at the cherry tree in the yard that was taller than she was now and had been producing in abundance for 4 years. "Are you happy, Caroline?" he asked. Not the way people ask it when they expect a simple answer, but the way he always asked things, the way that meant he actually wanted to know. She thought about it fully, which he had always given her the space to do. She thought about Philadelphia and the gray winters and the dead aunt and the dead cousin and the terrifying morning on the main street. She thought about the boarding house going up board by board and the Creswick situation and the October supper and the porch in December, and the ring with the turquoise stone and the church in February and Thomas's birth and Alina's serene eyes and the fever and the cherry tree and the expansion and the life, the full, built, deliberate, surprising life. "Yes," she said, "completely." He kissed her temple and held her closer, and she felt the warmth of it, the warmth of him in the October cold of the Nevada night. In the spring of 1889, Thomas Morgan, at 17, and already planning the law studies he would pursue as soon as he was old enough to be taken seriously, began his informal apprenticeship in his father's office, learning the paper side of the marshal's work, the documentation and the correspondence and the territorial filings that Monroe handled with less enthusiasm than the field work, but with equal care. Thomas was extraordinarily good at it, which surprised Monroe slightly and did not surprise Caroline at all. Alina at 14 produced a mathematical paper, at Mrs. Park's encouragement, analyzing the efficiency of the water distribution system for the Silver Mesa mining operations, which was so precise and useful that it was actually implemented by the operations manager, a practical man who did not care that the analysis came from a 14-year-old girl as long as it worked, which it demonstrably did. Caroline watched her children and thought about the children she had been, about Thomas, her cousin, at whatever age, about Monroe at whatever age, about the Paiute children and the Shoshone children, and the children of miners and ranchers, and all the children of this particular place and time who would grow into the territory's complicated future. She thought about what she could give them, what the boarding house and the example of it could give them, beyond food and clean rooms and a warm lamp in the window. She started teaching, not formally, not with credentials, but she opened the kitchen of the Langston boarding house on 2 mornings a week to any young woman in town who wanted to learn to cook properly and keep accounts and run a household efficiently. She taught them what her aunt had taught her, and what Ruth Carver had taught her, and what 4 years of running a business in a hard place had taught her. And she did not make it small or domestic in the limiting sense of the word, but large, the way she had always believed it was. The women who came were of every background the town could produce. There were the daughters of miners and the wives of ranchers and young women who had arrived on their own, as she had, looking for something they could build. Mabel Crow sent her daughter, a girl named Sarah, who had Mabel's intelligence and a formidable skill with numbers that Alina immediately recognized as belonging to the same order as her own. Monroe watched this operation with the particular pleasure of a man who is married to a woman he genuinely admires and has the good sense to say so. He told her it was one of the most useful things he had seen in 6 towns, the teaching, the deliberate creation of skills and confidence in the people who would run the next decade's households and businesses. He said it plainly and without decoration, which was his way, and she accepted it the same way. In October of 1889, Caroline discovered she was expecting again, which neither she nor Monroe had been prepared for at this late stage, Thomas being 8 already and Alina in her formative years of intense study. She told Monroe on a Sunday evening, and he was quiet for a moment and then looked at her with such undisguised delight that she started laughing. "You are ridiculous," she said. "I am tremendously happy," he said. "You are both," she said. The 3rd child arrived in June of 1890, a boy they named William, who came into the world with a personality entirely unlike either of his siblings, easy and sunny, and interested in everyone around him with a social generosity that was his own particular gift. Thomas at 8 was immediately serious about being a good older brother and took the role with his characteristic thoroughness. Alina at 8 applied herself to understanding the new arrival as a scientific puzzle before she loved him, and then loved him with a depth that was entirely her own. The summer of 1890 was hot, as Nevada summers are, and the boarding house was full, and the dining room was in constant operation, and Caroline was managing all of it with a new baby on her hip for a good portion of the day, which was possible because Alina had become the kind of colleague who could be trusted with anything, and because Thomas, 14 now and of considerable practical use, had made himself the unofficial manager of the kitchen garden and the supply arrangements. Monroe was home more now. The territorial work had settled into a rhythm, the major structural battles largely won or documented for the longer fight, and he had a strong team of deputies who handled the circuit competently. He was spending more evenings on the porch and more mornings in the kitchen and more afternoons in the corral, teaching William to sit on a horse when William was 2, which was perhaps slightly early, but Monroe had judged the temperament and the horse correctly, and it went fine. Ruth Carver told Caroline one afternoon in the fall of 1891, over coffee in the parlor, that she had never in 30 years of living in the West seen a marriage that worked the way the Morgan marriage worked. "Most people get smaller around each other," Ruth said with her direct bluntness that Caroline loved. "They wear each other down. You two get bigger, like having someone there to back you up makes you bolder rather than less." Caroline thought about that. "I think it is because he never once asked me to be smaller," she said. "Not once, not in 11 years, and I never asked it of him either. We just let each other be fully what we are." Ruth was quiet for a moment in the way of a woman who has some complicated feelings about the men she has known in her own life. Then she said, "Well, that is what I would have wanted." "You deserve it," Caroline said. "You deserve everything you have not had." Ruth looked at her, and something in the older woman's face was very open for a moment, and then she picked up her coffee cup and said, "I am perfectly fine," in a tone that was not quite convincing but was brave, and Caroline let her have it. The 1890s came in with the decade's particular energy, the West changing around them, the territory pressing toward statehood, Nevada having achieved it in 1864 but still carrying the rough edges of a young state, still working out what it was going to be. Monroe followed these changes with the attention of a man who cared about institutions, who believed that how things were arranged mattered, that the shape of the law was the shape of justice, and therefore nothing to be indifferent about. He talked about it with Caroline in the evenings, and with Thomas, who was now 17 and heading to law school in the fall of 1891, which was a fact that both of them spent several private moments absorbing. The boy who had followed Monroe around the sheriff's office at 6 was going to become the kind of lawyer who could, as Monroe put it quietly to Caroline one night, do what I could only gesture at from where I stood. The morning Thomas left for Carson City, Monroe and Caroline stood on the porch of the boarding house together in the September light and watched the wagon carry their oldest child away down the main street. Thomas turned once and waved, with the Morgan expression of dignified reserve concealing everything underneath, and then the wagon rounded the bend and was gone. Monroe put his arm around Caroline's shoulders, and she leaned against him, and they stood there for a moment without speaking. "He is going to be extraordinary," Monroe said. "He already is," she said. Alina at 15 filled the house differently without Thomas in it, her personality expanding into the space and her morning table conversations, with Caroline deepening into something that was no longer mother and child, but more nearly the conversations of two people who were deeply interested in the same things and had come at them from different angles. William at 2 was learning words with the same social urgency that characterized everything he did, deploying them on any available person, including the boarding house guests, who were uniformly charmed by the round-faced boy who appeared at their table and offered informed opinions on the quality of the biscuits. In the spring of 1892, Monroe told Caroline he was not going to seek another term as marshal. He told her in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, with William in his lap and the spring light coming through the window onto the table, and he said it in the matter-of-fact way he said things that he had thought through very carefully. She looked at him. "Tell me why." "Because Thomas will be back from law school in 2 years," he said, "and this territory needs good attorneys more than it needs another term of me as marshal. And because Alina is going to need someone who can advocate for her in whatever direction she chooses to go, and I want to be here for that. And because William is too." He paused, "and because I have done what I can do from this particular seat and I am ready for the next thing." "What is the next thing?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. "I was thinking I might help you run this place," he said, "properly, as a business partner." She looked at him for a long moment, at the steady gray-blue eyes and the lines at their corners and the man behind all of it, the man from the porch of the sheriff's office on the first morning, offering her water and hard news with equal gentleness. "I would like that very much," she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one she had worked so hard to earn the first time and which now lived in her kitchen every morning. Monroe Morgan stepped down as territorial marshal in the fall of 1892, and the farewell held in the dining room of the Morgan House, as it was firmly called by then, was the largest event the expanded dining room had seen. The whole territory sent representatives, or so it seemed, and the speeches were long and genuine, and several of them made Caroline cry, which she allowed because by now she was no longer invested in hiding the things that moved her. Monroe received it all with his characteristic composure and said thank you in his plain-spoken way, and then said that the real work of the West was not done by the men with stars, but by the people who built the places worth protecting, and he looked at Caroline when he said it, in front of everyone, with no trace of self-consciousness. She looked back at him with everything she had, which was considerable. Thomas came home for the summer of 1893, taller than he had left and more assured in a way that was not arrogance but simple competence, the growth of a person who has been doing hard, real work and found they can do it. He was in his second year and doing brilliantly. His professors, apparently, slightly unsettled by the combination of his precision and his ability to make a moral argument that you could not find a flaw in. He sat at the kitchen table his first morning home and ate his mother's biscuits, and told her they were still the best food he had encountered in 2 years, which was the highest compliment available from a Morgan, and she received it as such. Alina at 16 was corresponding with a professor at the University of Nevada about mathematics, a correspondence that the professor had initiated after receiving the paper she had produced, which had found its way to him through the mining operations manager who had implemented it. She was going to university. This was simply a fact, not a question, and Monroe and Caroline had arranged for it with the same careful practicality they brought to everything. William at 3 was learning to read under Aliner's instruction, which consisted of Aliner sitting across from him with a board and chalk, and refusing to accept anything less than his full attention, which he gave because Aliner's attention was a force of nature, and it was easier to comply. He could already count to 20 with reliable accuracy, and had opinions about the different horses in the town stable that were surprisingly well informed. The winter of 1893 was the winter Caroline allowed herself to notice that everything was good. Not perfect, never perfect, the territory still carried its injustices and its difficulties and its hard edges, and people she loved had died, and there were things she and Monroe still argued about from their different angles, because they had always argued cleanly and honestly, and always come to something better for it. But the substance of her life was good, deeply and completely good, in all the ways that mattered. She was sitting in the parlor one December evening, the lamp lit and Monroe across from her in the other chair reading the territorial newspaper, and the sounds of the house were around them. William's small voice telling some story to himself upstairs, Aliner's door closed with the particular firmness of a young woman doing serious mathematics, and in the morning Thomas would be back for Christmas. She looked at Monroe over the lamp, at his face bent to the paper, at the familiar shape of him in the familiar chair. He looked up as though she had called him, which she had not, and he looked back at her, and the gray-blue eyes were as steady and as warm as they had ever been. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking." He folded the paper and set it aside. "Then I'll look back," he said. They sat in the parlor on the December evening and looked at each other, which is a thing that people who love each other deeply can do without it being strange, and the lamp threw its warm circle around them, and outside the window the Nevada winter was doing its cold and brilliant work, and the boarding house that was also their home breathed around them with the warmth and solidity of a thing well built. Thomas came home for Christmas, and Aliner produced a gift for everyone that was a small pamphlet she had written about the history of the water systems of Dusty Creek, which was both the most Aliner thing anyone could imagine and genuinely interesting. And William gave everyone drawings he had made in secret over the previous weeks, slightly asymmetrical portraits that captured everyone with a sweetness that had several of the adults blinking more than usual. Monroe built a fire in the new fireplace that he and Ed Galvez had installed in the dining room the previous fall, and the family gathered around it after the Christmas dinner, and the room was warm and full and real. "Your father and I have something to tell you," Caroline said, looking at her children, at Thomas's serious face and Aliner's curious one and William's wide, attentive eyes. Monroe reached over and took her hand, which he did without thinking, the gesture of 15 years. "The boarding house is going to expand again," he said. "Your mother has decided to open a second dining room specifically for events, and there will be a permanent cooking school attached to it." It was the thing they had planned together over the fall, the next iteration of what she had been building since that first morning on the main street. A real cooking school, structured and sustained, that could teach the skills she had been teaching informally for years to more people and with more resources and more impact. Thomas looked at her with his father's steadiness and said, "That is the right next thing." Aliner said, "I want to help you design the financial structure for it." William said, "Can I be in the cooking school?" Monroe laughed and Caroline laughed, and the room was full of it. Later, after the fire had burned low and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Monroe and Caroline stood in the kitchen, the warm, lamplit kitchen that was the heart of everything, and she looked at the ring on her finger, the silver band with the turquoise stone, its surfaces worn smooth now with years. "Are you happy, Monroe?" she asked him, borrowing his own question back the way he had once borrowed hers. He looked at her, the gray-blue eyes in the lamplight, everything that was him present in his face. "More than I know how to say," he said, which is a significant thing for a man who has always preferred to say things plainly. She went to him and put her arms around him, and he held her in the warm kitchen with the Nevada winter outside, and the sleeping house around them, and the whole long, beautiful arc of the life they had built together present in every detail of the room. She thought of Thomas's letter, that first letter, 6 months out of Philadelphia, arriving on a gray afternoon, offering her a place in the West. She thought of the battered trunk and the derringer and the $43. She thought of the morning on the main street, and the man who had stepped off the porch to tell her the hard truth with the most careful kindness. She thought of the boarding house going up board by board in the spring light. She thought of the first dinner and the biscuits and the gray-blue eyes across the table. She thought of the sunset on the low rise and the words that had been spoken there and meant everything they said. She thought of the ring on her finger and the church in February and the children, Thomas and Alina and William, 3 different people entirely, each of them a surprise and a wonder. She thought of Ruth Carver's laugh and Mabel Crow's beaded covering, and the cherry tree that was taller than she was, and the cooking school that was coming in the spring. She thought of the territory and its injustices that Monroe had never stopped working against, and the small gains and the slow and imperfect arc of justice, and the importance of doing what you could from where you stood. She thought of all of it, the whole full-made thing of her life, and she held on to Monroe Morgan in the warm kitchen and felt the solidity of him, the 15 years of solidity, the man who had never once asked her to be smaller, and who was still here, still holding on, still steady and warm and entirely himself. "Good," she said. "That is exactly what I wanted to hear." Outside, the Nevada winter held the desert in its cold and brilliant grip, and the stars did their ancient work over the mountains and the sage in the town of Dusty Creek, which was still rough and still alive, and still working out what it was going to be. The cherry tree stood dormant in the garden, waiting for spring with the patience of a living thing that knows how to wait. The sign above the door said Morgan House in the letters that had weathered to a fine, honest gray. Inside the warm kitchen, the lamp burned. Everything was as it should be, and would continue to be, for all the springs and winters yet to come.